Good morning and welcome to Behind the Screen. Thanks to everyone for joining us. I am JM. This is a show where we talk about games from a developer's point of view, a designer's point of view, trying to hone our craft, if you will, as we start looking at the games that we love, why we love them, and what makes them great. So we're continuing a series on fantasy. We've done high fantasy, we've done epic fantasy. Today we're stepping away from that. We're dropping down into sword and sorcery fantasy. So this will be the first of 3 episodes where we're going to follow the same format. We're going to start with looking at the sources of the genre. We're going to look at what mechanical considerations on Tuesday are necessary for a good sword and sorcery game. And then we're going to wrap up with how do we emulate the sword and sorcery genre at our tables. Good morning to Praetorian, to Professor, and to Phantom, the three P's of good chat membership. Thank you for joining us. So, when we think of sword and sorcery, the quintessential archetypal story and hero is that of Robert E. Howard's Conan. Right? You have this barbarian who has come in out of the... Ooh, there you go. The three pillars of the community. I like that, Phantom. Have a weird point. Right? He comes down into kind of the civilized world and makes his way with only his wit and his strength. So sword and sorcery really encapsulates the idea of heroes of might versus villains of magic, not to be confused with heroes of might and magic, which is a completely different genre than we're talking about today. So we have Howard's Conan, we have Lankmar's Fafhrd and Grey Mouser, we have Michael Moorcock's Elric and Corum in this genre. We have the entire oeuvre of Thieves' World. Thieves' World fits a sword and sorcery style genre, even though the magic at some points strays a little higher than we typically see in sword and sorcery, like prototypical sword and sorcery genre. Hello, Ian. Good to see you. And Jacob, and also Ian. John Carter of Mars has sword and sorcery, but it also is planetary romance, Phantom, and we will definitely jump into that when we get to our sci-fi oeuvre. But yes, John Carter of Mars. I don't know why I always say John Carter as opposed to John Carter. I think it sounds more Martian to me, but John Carter of Mars has some sword and sorcery elements in there as well. So what are the core things that all of these authors sort of pick up on and put forth? What are the tropes of our genre? Because as we've talked about, this is really a look at a genre. What are the pillars that hold it up? How do those pillars get translated into mechanics in the great games that emulate this genre? And then finally, right, we get to how do we replicate this in our games? So what are kind of the core tenets of the sword and sorcery genre? And yeah, Phantom, I would agree with that, right, at least Asimov's, as an Asimov or Clark says, any significantly advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. And I will be really interested to hear your thoughts when we get into when we really look at John Carter. I hadn't really considered him sword and sorcery, but the more I think of it, it's one of those, again, when we're talking about genres, very few people write in a clear, delineated line. Thanks, Praetorian. You too can have a weird point. There's some overlap. So yeah, so what's our first thing? Well, obviously, it's the idea of law versus chaos. We've heard that before in in epic fantasy, but here what this really means, we kind of want to flip it. It's really more chaos versus law, in the idea that it's civilization versus barbarism. It takes its roots from the rise and the fall of the Roman Empire from Gibbon. And Gibbon's cycle, briefly, is hard times create strong people create good times create weak people create hard times. And so we have this this cycle. And so Howard, this was something that really enraptured Howard's mind, that civilization would rise and then the barbarians would storm the gates. But we also see in The Phoenix and the Sword that the barbarian becomes king. We have this movement from, as we talked about, symbolically from the edge to the center, and then the center is remade, raising a new era of law, right? The Goths come down, the Vandals, they sack Rome, but very quickly they become the new kings of the area. Ian says, we have Thieves' World has some high magic and strong and mid-level. The Mana Catastrophe occurs in Book 9, and then it's What Society Without Magic. Yeah. And Thieves' World has some very strong elements of this idea of civilization versus barbarism, surviving less by the spells that you know and more by your skill and your strength of mind. Even Fafhrd and the Greymouser, there's a lot of magic in and around Lankmar. Greymouser is a failed mage, but routinely magic kind of straight. Well, we'll talk about this right now. When it comes to antagonists in Sword and Sorcery, those who wield magic are typically more of the an than the pro. And what do I mean by that? Right? Thulsa Doom, Teth. Oh, hold on, my brain got to go to my notes. Thulsa Doom is our great look at the Conan movie, but there's also my brain just died. I didn't put him in my notes because I was clearly very easily going to pick up on that. Toth Amon. Ha! I knew I would remember that from the Conan actual stories. We have some of the mages in Thieves' World. Although Elric wields magic, most of the decadent mages that he encounters possess even more. And what we see here in Sword and Sorcery is that unlike Epic, where magic is very mysterious, or High, where magic is very pervasive, in Sword and Sorcery, what we kind of have here is magic is slow, it's very dangerous, and it most often is wielded only by the villains of the tale because magic is inherently corruptive. I was just reading a new book that I got at Gen Con, the newest Gumshoe book, Swords of the Serpentine, and Kevin and Emily do a great job of capturing this genre. Swords of the Serpentine is one of the books we'll talk about on Tuesday when we talk about games that really encapsulate the genre well. So yes, we have more of antagonistic magic. Magic isn't something that causes joyful wonder or causes us to stand back and view the world differently like it does in epic fantasy, but neither is it the wondrous power that we see in high fantasy where it is wielded sort of by both sides equally. In Sword and Sorcery, magic is almost always in the hands of those who wish to be tyrannical, abusive, or corrupted. And so that brings an interesting dichotomy also where you have civilization versus barbarism. You have the riddle of steel, if you will, versus the powers of the dark magical forces in the world. Published at the beginning of the Sanctuary has been invaded and controlled by barbarians. Yes. So yeah, Ian's saying the Next Generation, which is the latter half of the Thieves' World novels, this whole flip happens yet again. It is something, a lot of people have problems with Gibbon. Okay. But here's the thing. Very few people have actually built a legitimate case against Gibbon's cycle. Civilization eventually breaks down, goes into barbarism, and something new rises. It is the cycle of history. It's one of the great things about being a historian and one of the crappy things about being a historian. When things are good, you're like, yeah, but they'll always get worse. But when things are bad, you're always like, don't worry, in just several generations, things will work out. Woo! All right, Mr. Bob Crumb has arrived. So now we can get done with all of the jury stuff, and the party has started. Good to see you, Bob. Hope everything's going well. What are some other key tropes of Sword and Sorcery fiction? Well, and Ian will like this because this is one of the main tropes of the Thieves' World genre. We don't have that clear cut. I assume they were breakaway pants, Bob. We don't have the clear cut morality that we have in epic and high fantasy, especially epic fantasy. You have epic fantasy, and then you have high fantasy, and then you have low grimdark and sword and sorcery kind of here at the bottom. Things are morally gray. Excuse me. Our heroes are not defined by their virtue, but neither are they kind of depraved. They will make the selfish choice. They will make the choice that in the moment works best for this. Well, because our heroes are not always the shining virtue, Professor. It's a good question. Professor says, how do you say there's no clear-cut morality when you said magic is almost always bad? Well, because in Sword and Sorcery, while yes, magic occupies this pole of the morality spectrum, we don't get all the way to the opposition. Take Conan, for example. Although, if you actually read carefully, Conan almost always makes the moral choice. It is not clear-cut in the story. Conan will always rescue the people who need rescuing, but that's never the reason that he's going out. He's always searching for treasure, trying to pull himself up out of another instance. And it's only when the chips are down does he makes sort of the moral choice. Elric is kind of the same way. Elric starts off very idealistic, but very quickly starts compromising his morals to the point that at the end, spoiler alert, it came out years ago, there's a statute of limitations. Not a statue of limitations. That is not a thing. Although I feel like it could be a really interesting magic item, the statue of limitations. Maybe at the boundary of an empire, they put the statues of limitations, sort of like Terminus in the Roman Empire. Anyway, statute of limitations on spoilers. Right, at the end of the story, Elric has continued to make choices that in the moment seemed necessary, but at the end are utterly damning, and Stormbringer consumes his soul. Conan never sets out to stop Tathamon. It's not like he's like, oh my gosh, Tathamon needs to be destroyed. He is clearly evil. He gets drawn into these plots, and very quickly it's really about the money before he gets drawn into the plots. Fafhrd and Greymouser are protagonists in Thieves' World. They're not chasing the good. They're chasing the coin. And sometimes that coin leads them to good actions, and sometimes that coin leads them to bad actions. It does sound like a Piers Anthony thing, Ian. I was actually just thinking that because they also had the trophy of the rear end of a cat that was given out when things were really bad. So you had the catastrophe. I love Piers Anthony. He probably is lodged really deep here inside my brain, which is why Torg is filled with so many puns. The other thing that we see is, right, in epic fantasy, it is the moral virtue of the hero that carries them through. In high fantasy, it's the power and of both the cause and the heroes that carries them through. In Sword and Sorcery, it is very rarely a moral imperative that the heroes win. They win through strength, wit, and skill, right? It's essentially fantasy Darwinism. Only the strong, only the tough survive. In fact, that's one of the key themes. Survival is one of the key themes of Sword and Sorcery fiction. How do we keep things rolling along to the next day? So, right, Michael Moorcock set out to write the anti-Conan story with Elric. So instead of Conan, this brawny, very cunning barbarian from the outside, right? Elric is the weak, albino, magically powerful king of Melnibone who is sort of exiled, goes on a journey. There's many times where he journeys to the fringe and comes back to the center. But still, Elric doesn't survive by the strength of his magic. He survives by his wit, his erudition, and then the physical power granted to him by strange alchemical potions and that of Stormbringer. So in the end, he ends up writing while a commentary on the sword and sorcery genre, he establishes one of the key themes of the sword and sorcery genre. Also, camels. I know Chris is going to bring this up, right? You get the fact that camels are clearly evil in the Conan movies. Otherwise, why would Conan punch so many camels? If you don't believe me, just Google Conan camel punching, and you will receive a plethora of GIFs and videos. Praetorian says here, in the film, Conan doesn't rescue the princess in Fate Doom because it's right. He does it because he got hired to rescue her and wants revenge. Yeah, there's no inherent morality to Conan's actions. He's out for coin and vengeance. The fact that something really good happens for the world is almost sort of secondary, tertiary, accidental to the fact that Conan gets paid, he gets the princess, and he kills the person that he wanted revenge on. The other thing that's really interesting, and this will be very interesting to discuss when we get into mechanics and how to emulate this, because this almost flies in the face of the grand campaign. Most sword and sorcery stories are episodic, right? You may be able to build a timeline, but it's not the through story that we're interested in. It's not like the Wheel of Time where we want the beginning, the middle, and the end. It's not the Lord of the Rings where we clearly see this journey from the Shire to Mordor and back. Conan stories just happen. We have some chronology because they reference other things, or you have the Phoenix and the Sword, which is clearly both the first written story and the last chronological story of Conan when he is old and a king. But sword and sorcery fiction is very sort of episodic. Part of that is because we want to keep... The hero has to stay hungry. They get big riches at the end of their stories, but inevitably they've lost it all before the next story happens chronologically. So we have these big wins. Conan steals from the Tower of the Elephant. Belit raids the coasts. Elric recovers the potion that he needs to save the woman that he loves. And yet by the next story, Conan is broke. Elric is back into the world searching for something new. Belit, I don't believe, comes into the main canon, again, aside from Queen of the Black Coast. But again, we have this sort of ebb and flow. As opposed to an arc, we have points of interest along the timeline of the character. I mean, I don't honestly believe that Howard really cared about that to start. We'll have a discussion with Gabe about that later. Like, he found his voice in Conan, and he just wanted to keep writing. Oh, sorry, I meant Lankmar. I don't know that I said that they were from Thieves' World, but Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser and characters from Thieves' World have a lot in common. Lankmar and Sanctuary shall remain very separate in my world. If I made that confusion, thank you for pointing it out, Ian. So yeah, those are the exemplars of this genre, and why also the tropes that we're going to pull out and really look at on Tuesday when we talk about mechanics and games that really reinforce this. Some other things that we talked about that have a very sword and sorcery feel are, of course, the Beastmaster movie. If you have not watched the Beastmaster movies, you should go do so. Maybe not. Maybe they hold a place in my brain higher than what they should. The cartoon, the old cartoon, specifically, of He-Man and the Masters of the Universe. Parts of The Witcher have this feel of sword and sorcery, of an episodic hero, at least in the short stories. We get more of an arc later on, but we have this feel of a hero for hire, morally gray, who's going out to defeat monsters. Monsters. Another great trope we should talk about in sword and sorcery. In sword and sorcery, most often we have human antagonists. Now, before everybody gets up in arms and are like, well, hey, Conan fought this monstrosity or that monstrosity. Yes, we do have that. But they function differently than they do in other genres, right? Monsters in epic fantasy help tell the story of the world. They help build out the world. They also define, they fall, right, they're clearly on the moral opposite side of the heroes. In high fantasy, monsters are a result of magical exploitation, experimentation, which gives us this broad oeuvre of monsters that add to the wideness and the weirdness of the world. Most often in sword and sorcery, monsters are a direct call to one of the themes we've talked about. They're there specifically for a reason. The degenerate beastmen of Conan are there because they show the cycle of highs and lows. Some of the creatures are very clearly because the cities have grown decadent. Each creature kind of points directly to one of the things that the author is trying to talk about. So instead of having decadent nobles, we will have these degenerate, weird, mutant things that once were nobles. Instead of showing the aristocracy having gone bad and just attacking the people and feeding off of them, we'd have a vampire doing that because you have something at the top that's feeding on the multitudes below. So monsters in sword and sorcery need to be very specifically targeted to reinforce one of the tropes that we've talked about. We're going to talk about that on Tuesday and Thursday next week. So let's see what the chat has said. Yes, Samurai Jack fits, especially. There are key watershed moments where it is very clearly sword and sorcery. Yes, demon summoning is a big thing in sword and sorcery as well. You have this otherworldly power, and it ties back into the idea that magic is inherently corruptive in some way. We would not see our heroes necessarily. Elric, again, kind of being an exception, dealing with demons for power. Stormbringer is essentially that, so I would say that is a trope that Michael Moorcock is trying to rebel against. However, everyone he encounters is making bigger and bigger and better deals with the demons and the Lords of Hell and the Lords of Chaos to defeat Elric. So we kind of have that trope there as well. Whew. So that is sword and sorcery. That is our introduction to sword and sorcery. That is our introduction to the genre, the tropes, and the things we're going to try and see about games which really fit these mechanics and these tropes. So as a spoiler alert for everybody who's here, the games we're going to look at, we're really going to look at the Conan game, the 2D20 one. We're going to look at the Forbidden Lands by Free League. We're going to look at Jackals by yours truly, because I was writing a sword and sorcery game and I really wanted to emphasize this. And Bob, I'm so glad that you asked what is best in life, because we're going to be looking at Swords of the Serpentine, and one of the best parts of character creation is you have to define what are the 3 things that are best in life for your character. Conan's answer, of course, being destroy your enemies, drive them before you, hear the lamentations of the women. So with that note, we will end this episode of Behind the Screen. It really does help you define your plot, Professor. I think you would really enjoy Gumshoe and Swords of the Serpentine. Speaking of, we're going to be looking at Gumshoe this month on Iconic. Actually, no. We're actually going to be having an interview this month with Rob of Pelgrane, because they announced the new edition of 13th Age, Escalated Edition, at Gen Con. So we're going to have him on. We're going to be pausing our Gumshoe look so that we can talk about 13th Age with Rob, talk about all of the changes that are coming down the pipeline. So, but I would say another show that we do that talks a little bit about sword and sorcery is Glorantha has a lot of sword and sorcery feel. Magic is way higher, but there's some interesting sword and sorcery things that we're going to talk about there on Tuesday. So, thank you all for joining in. Chris, it is good to see you. Ian, Bob, thanks for joining us. To the 3 pillars, thank you so much. We'll be back on Tuesday with more Behind the Screen when we talk about games and mechanics which reinforce this genre. So until next time, stay safe, stay healthy, stay gaming. I will see you all on Tuesday. And this has been another Behind the Screen. Thanks for joining.